Now we'll see how a sorcerer fares. Against cold steel.
Greetings, Prime Explorers, and today we're going to talk about the art of the possible. We're looking at the cathedral in Florence, or Florence Cathedral, and it's got many other names like all these structures tend to. And you might recall in earlier explorations, for members, we talked about how Florence Cathedral was almost building number one for the channel. The baseline building that is totally and completely impossible. And I know you're saying, well, wait a minute, the title of this video is Art of the Possible, so what do you mean impossible? Well, Florence Cathedral was constructed from roughly 12 to 1400. Of course, you know how I feel about the accuracy of those dates, but let's be generous and say it was accurate. This was constructed before the Industrial Revolution, before the Renaissance, by people who were told had an average age of 27 thereabouts, depending on who you ask, and people who weren't very well educated, not very well motivated, but it's very well documented that they pulled off this cathedral, and then subsequently they built its very impressive dome. Now, a couple reasons why this did not end up becoming building number one for all explorations on the channel, and the main reason being is that this is sort of an off-limits building. You might have noticed that there is some content that for whatever reason just tends to encounter technical difficulties. Now, I'm not going to go off on some tirade speculating about why certain things encounter technical difficulties, but the other reason, of course, being is that I don't actually have quick and easy access to this wondrous structure. And certainly I wanted to make sure that I had access to the structure that was going to be building number one, because I believe it's important to get on the ground and really analyze the construction materials, the layout. Yes, you can look at someone else's footage, you can look at video footage, but there's nothing quite like actually going there and interfacing with a true old world structure. And after doing this officially for over a year now, and beyond that for several years, I do realize that there are many telltale signs. Now, going back to Des Moines, the location of our actual building number one, the Iowa State Capitol, you see to the left here we're flying past what's known as the 801 Grand Building, built by the good people of Principal Insurance Group in the late 1980s in 2 years, and even though it's the tallest building in Des Moines, Iowa, in no way does it come close to comparing to the Iowa State Capitol that you see in the distance there off to the right. In fact, when you're driving actually on the interstate or on the ground, the Iowa State Capitol is the most prominent building. And for that matter, what is it about the state of Iowa? There's something about it that seems to have retained some identity of the old world, and I'm not sure what it is. And it's not to say there's anything more special about Iowa than the other areas, but whenever you go between those rivers, the Mississippi and the Missouri, you definitely know you're no longer in Nebraska and you're no longer in Illinois. And that's not a ding on those states. But going to the concept of state capitals in general, for whatever reason, and perhaps it's because the mainstream account of the state capitals being more accepted and being more reinforced by various historical documents, whether they're at the federal, state, local, or university level, that these are indeed structures that our civilization built. And there's no question it. We have architects, we have contractors. Well, what was it about the state capitol that really caught my attention? Specifically the Iowa State Capitol, but really we could apply it to many of the other state capitals that defy the examples of the capabilities at the time. Well, I had a good friend, and this was a family friend, who was a building contractor. And he had actually done projects for Hubble Realty. They're one of the large realty companies in Des Moines. You could say they're the de facto only realty company. I'm not going to go that far and suggest that, but let's just say that if you want something done, they're the people you contact. And they know all the best contractors. And I asked him a question concerning the Iowa State Capitol, which is the only 5-domed state capitol in the United States, and virtually one of the only 5-dome capitals in the entire land. There's a couple others. And the question I asked him is, how long would it take all the resources being thrown at it with modern technology to construct the Iowa State Capitol if it was started from scratch in 2023? Because that's when I asked the question. And I noticed the odd thing. He looked at me with a puzzled look, and he really seemed to consider it. And he didn't have an instant answer, which isn't surprising because we know there's nobody in the land that are building structures such as these anymore, whether it's a state capitol, a cathedral, or anything like this. We're constantly reassured that we can do it. Our civilization could build buildings like this. We're just not particularly inclined to, as we now look at the official Iowa State Capitol itself. And the reason we're told is that it's too expensive. And you might remember when I was looking at this scagliola, or this rock, this composite fake rock that they called it, or fake granite, or fake marble, it didn't really solve the answers. It actually added more complexity to the logistics problem, because they still admit there's 29 different types of marble in the Iowa State Capitol, there's numerous types of granite, and then there's the limestone. And then add to that this material that you were mixing together as some sort of fake or facade marble or granite. It doesn't solve the logistics question, it makes it more complicated. And back to the question I asked my contractor friend. What did he actually say? He said it would probably take anywhere from 30 to 40 years with modern equipment. Furthermore, he said that there's no way they would be able to get the actual quality of materials. And so I said, even with unlimited financial resources and that amount of time with modern equipment, you could not replicate the Iowa State Capitol. And again, he looked, he pondered, and he said, no, it would take over 30 years, best case, and it would not be the same thing. Now, it was upon asking that question, and keep in mind this is before I did my first exploration. You're probably asking, well, wait a minute, this is very pertinent information. Why didn't you include it in the first exploration of the Iowa State Capitol? I'll tell you why. We know exactly what would have happened to that video if I did. We'll see if this member content video survives for that fact. But it was really one of those things that convinced me that this is an impossible building. And there's very little doubt that the Florence Cathedral is an impossible building, especially given the limitations of the time. Now, of course, we know somebody built this building, somebody built the Florence Cathedral, but somebody was not constrained by the limitations that we have with our capabilities. Somebody had grander capabilities. And that's why it's very interesting that they try to pass off a facade rock. And they do say that artificial rock was used in the construction of buildings back in the 1700s. Of course they do. But think about that. Does that really sort out the logistics challenge, or does that simply complicate it more? Because now you're bringing in yet another material. And think about how absurd the idea of bringing in 29 different types of marble to the middle of Iowa in the 1870s would be. And remember, at least what we're told about Iowa. An agrarian state, an isolated state, a state that to this day is known for its agricultural output. Yes, food is very important, but it's not gold, it's not diamond, it's not vast natural resources that you could sell for tremendous yields of prices in produce. Oh no. Yet the Civil War was over, and the first thought in their mind is, we're going to build a palace on a hill, and we're going to do it in 15 years. And yet this is a structure that we could not replicate to this day. And so what is the mainstream's response to this? What is the mainstream's response to us asking questions and really pushing this matter? Well, they have to have the indulgence in the art of the possible. They have to try to talk this up like this really was done under the limitations of the time. And what are the responses that you've seen? Well, it's very well documented that everybody was craftsmen and they could pull anybody off the street and anybody could actually carve this. And the fact that they say that they carved this, whether it's the dome in the Iowa State Capitol or the dome in the Cathedral of St. Paul in London, it's a laugh. And keep in mind, there's a lot of similarities between the Cathedral in St. Paul from the 1600s and the State Capitol in Iowa from the late, purportedly, 1800s. Yeah, 200 years between those two structures, and yet so many similarities. And you can look at many other structures and think about this account that they have of this facade rock that's not real, or what they're saying is not real concrete, but we know what it is. Looking at the Scottish Rite Temple, now I'm thinking that that double eagle reminds me of the Imperial Standard, and I still have Warhammer 40k on the brain from last night's exploration. But it's all intriguing how it comes together, and going to this other very impressive basilica or church, and you notice that once again, there is the similarity to what we saw with the cathedral in Florence. But what exactly is the construction material? And look at how it's fit together like this. Now again, is this a genuine, bona fide old world building? I'd say it is. But they'll tell us that they created this construction material because it's not real rock. It's not real concrete. It is a facade. That's what they'll tell us. But yet I have always questioned this because it seems like it's a response to our more recent explorations, because somebody wouldn't tell you about this basilica 20 years ago that, oh yes, this is just a facade. This is just imitation material. And once again, it always goes to the old response, well, if we were so inclined, we could very easily do this building today. But is that really the situation? What are your thoughts? And by all means, let me know in the comments. I still love this little obelisk over here off to the side, and if you actually go and analyze that obelisk, it does seem to be something of a more fine and, how shall we say, enduring granite. Well, let's take a look at some more examples of these impossible buildings. The original example, though, of the Iowa State Capitol is that it has all the hallmarks that we have in the Old World building. It has the different coloring schemes depending on the light. It has the very elaborate and incredible ornate interior. And, of course, it also has the vast underground. And what's interesting, and I'll share this with you, many, many years ago, there was a time when you could actually go up into the cupola of the state capitol. And let me tell you, even remembering it from decades ago, what is seen up there is completely shocking and jaw-dropping. You only see pictures of it, and they're very minimal up-close pictures. You can't appreciate the complexities of the layers of the dome. And of course, there's always the fact that they tell us, they don't bother hiding it. Yes, the dome is coated with full gold. They don't paint it gold, it's cheaper to use real gold. And they've even replaced it, or so they tell us. And here you have it in this image. Yes, it's cheaper to replace gold. 23.75 karat gold. Oh sure, why not? We just have gold laying all over the place. Of course, I posited the question, is this real gold, or is this something even more advanced and even more ornate than gold, and perhaps having some other capacity or capability that we're not aware of? And these are the kind of questions that I do ask. For whatever reason, this particular state capitol being one of the finest, and I would go so far as to say it's right up there with the Connecticut state capitol. And the fact that it's the 5 known state capital, I think that's what gives it the slight edge. But going back and looking at all these examples and all these little details within this incredible palace that's in the middle of the Midwest, in a state that is known for being an agrarian state. Now, don't take me wrong, you'll get the finest sweet corn in Iowa, and you'll get some of the finest beef you can ever imagine. Pork and chicken's pretty good too. That's if, you eat meat, but I'm not here to tell you what to eat or how to live your life. It's just an example. It's what Iowa's known for. But I pulled up some of the archives, and we've seen these images before of the state capitol, and of course they tell us what years these are from. This image from 1939, so during the Great Depression, and I guess we were just putting people to work. Now they say this is on the state capitol grounds, although this is quite some distance off to the way, I'm trying to remember the cardinal direction here, and I'm having a disorientation moment. Okay, so this would be to the south, because there's the column, soldier-sailors column, another anomaly in and of itself. And what exactly are they doing here? Well, it looks like they're re-bricking this area, but what's this all for? Are they terracing the land? Very intriguing. And why is there so much what looks to be deadfall? Are they doing this during winter? Why would they be working during the soil when it's all frozen? Well, don't ask those kinds of questions. And then here we have 1948, and you can get the clue that there was a lot more to this entire complex. So again, looks like they're showing us another winter photo, because there's one thing about Iowa: during the summer it's all green and all the trees are in bloom. And then you may have seen this picture before. I recall John covering this, John Levi, when he did his original exploration on the Iowa State Capitol, and joking that one of these shacks was his house. But if you look a little more carefully in the background, you will see some more well-constructed buildings that may have reflected something that remained of the civilization that came before, or whatever the heck's really going on, alternating realities or imposing timelines. And then, of course, we have our famous construction photo here in 1884, so only 13 years in from when they started it. And then, of course, the amazing dome with the line or flagpole or whatever coming out of it. Yeah, all kinds of issues with this image, but we don't need to go over it again. And then the construction of the state capitol. Look at that. We got some horses and wagons and guys with shovels. And yeah, that's all it was. Guys with shovels. They dug it out, dug out the tunnels, dug out the vast foundation. This image doesn't even look like it's anywhere on the grounds of the Iowa State Capitol, to be honest with you. But, you can say whatever you want to. There's no way to verify it. I wasn't there in the 1800s. And then voila, we have a completed state capitol, 1927. And then the soldiers and sailors column right next to it. Little over 130-foot column that's nearby, and look, a little smokestack. And then, of course, more aerial imagery, and we can see it from another perspective. But very, very intriguing. And then some close-ups, cleaning this old chandelier. How old is this chandelier, and what exactly is it made out of? Cleaning up the banister, and you can see some of the detailing in the banisters and the stairway. And this isn't even the one that's made out of the 29 different types of marble. And believe me, when you walk up that main staircase in the Iowa State Capitol, you're going to accept that it's made out of 29 different types of marble. You can even see in the background here that they still had the same materials, the fine granite or whatever the heck it really is. And this stuff is endured to this day. Is this image really from 1934? I would think so, but was it really 90 years ago or was it more? Who knows for sure? Oh yes, the famous image of driving the car up the stairs. Well, of course they had no compunctions about driving the car up the stairs. They knew those stairs would hold. They've never had to replace those stairs. You could probably take an M1A1 70-ton tank up there and those stairs would hold just fine. People talk about, it's the inheritors that are not taking it seriously, and I would agree with that. You can see the people standing up here on the balcony. Drive your car up the stairs, it's what we do. Apparently when they were manufacturing automobiles in Des Moines, yes, that did happen in the past as well. And then some other images of working on one of the lights and just giving you an idea of how well equipped this place always was and always has been. And then this final image right here where it looks like they've traced it. Yes, why not? Now, I just wanted to show you this imagery here because this structure is gone, and this looks like a defined old world building. You see maybe some remnants here. We're not actually down in downtown Des Moines where there's no doubt that there were larger structures that were there. There were a lot of what we'd think of as skyscrapers today. That got torn down over the years. The other interesting thing is you've got the smokestack here, and that appeared in the painted picture. So again, giving the idea that this was possibly part of some sort of perhaps a compound, power generation compound, that for whatever reason this may have been one of the main forum buildings, if you will, or perhaps one of the final buildings that stood to try to hold together what was left of the civilization before things fell apart, which is why they call Des Moines City of the Monks or River of the Monks. That's where the name comes from. Who knows? I know, it's speculation, but I'm trying to put the pieces together the best I can. And then this structure over here, which is quite Greco-Roman. And I think, if memory serves, this is part of the State Historical Society. It still stands, and it's got a nice little dome on it. You can't see it very well in this image. But it just gives you an idea. What was this house exactly? Was this originally supposed to be the governor's residence? Of course, you've seen the governor's residence on Terrace Hill. And this terrain that's changed so much. These stairs that they drove the cars up on, and the very beautiful and impressive fountains. And the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that they dedicated to the veterans of the Civil War. But they finished it in the 1890s, but didn't bother dedicating it until after World War II in the 1940s. Yes, that's what the official account says. And then just looking at this architect's drawing of the state capitol, I always find this so interesting. Just out there in the grass by its lonesome. Maybe you could say it's a dirt road that goes past it, but just such an interesting and odd image that doesn't exactly look like the Iowa State Capitol. So, I know, you say you're endlessly obsessed with it, Aurelian, and you're absolutely right, because it's an enigma. And the more I look into it, the more questions I end up having. It's a beauty, and hopefully it's with us for a long time. And I do genuinely suspect that the reason a lot of these structures still stand is we lack the means to tear them down now. I think we know full well if we had the means to tear this building down, we would. But for whatever reason, I think certain structures were exposed to certain technologies, whether that was a frequency technology, some sort of cymatic, some sort of combination of frequency and cymatics, or even plasma fire, some sort of force that we don't understand that possibly weakened the structure of these buildings. And who knows, maybe some of these buildings, such as the Iowa State Capitol, the courthouse in Philadelphia, name many others, maybe they were impervious to these forces. They couldn't be weakened even by this more advanced weapons technology, or whatever you want to think of it as. And that's why they're still standing to this day. It's clear that they would get rid of these if they could, but they can't. One final thing to think about, and I mentioned it in the live stream last night, is the Rapidan Dam, or the Rapidan Dam, depending if you're from Virginia or Minnesota. And yes, I'm making pronunciation jokes again, and that's fine. If you want to hammer me for it, be my guest. I love pronunciation jokes. But anyway, I'll just go with Rapidan, so I'm not bouncing back and forth. A concrete gravity dam in Blue Earth River in Rapidan Township, southwest of Mankato, Minnesota. You might remember Mankato, Minnesota. It gets mentioned a lot in Little House on the Prairie because Walnut Grove wasn't too far from Mankato. They were always going to Mankato. But this is yet another example of infrastructure that was constructed in the early 1900s, 1908 to be specific, and they finished it in 1910. They even have this nice little picture here of people who are just, people who are just standing by the dam, watching it being constructed, while there's no actual construction going on the dam. And people dressed up really nicely. And of course they write down here, October 23rd, 1910. Blue Earth Dam. Oh, not the Rapidan Dam, but whatever, it doesn't matter. We can change the name whenever we want to. Does this image seem a little odd to you? Seems a little odd to me. Why would they just suddenly stop construction so everybody could go out there in their Sunday best, as everybody seemed to wear in the early 1900s, to go look at a dam while it was being built? Whatever the reasons. And yet, what happened with this dam? So they built it in 1910, but there's already an inconsistency. So completed in 1910, but they say the equipment used to generate power was two 750 kilowatt pressure cased Francis turbines. Oh, that's cool. But it was completed in 1910, right? You look up the Francis turbines, and when were the Francis turbines actually invented? Well, it says that the process of reaching them took from 1848 to 1920. That's odd. And again, I have looked at this and have verified. I know I'm just cheating by going off of Wikipedia, but really, at the end of the day, what's the difference between looking at a book and Wikipedia? A lot less than we might like to think. Believe me, doing this for a while, you try to cross-reference things, it's very problematic at best. But in any event, so they say they didn't have these until 1920, and that's when they really started to field these. And so what, did they have the experimental models that went in the Rapidan Dam when it was done at 1910? Or, were they the earlier models? I don't know. The nice thing about hand-waving history is you actually do have some options. But here's where it gets interesting. So in 1965, they say a record-breaking 500-year flood, which, 0.2% chance of a flood coming the next year that's worse. That's how they define it. Typically, we go the 1 in 100 chance or 1% chance of it being equaled or exceeded in a year. Well, this is less than that. So a very, very rare flood damaged it. But it didn't wipe it out. It didn't destroy it. It didn't flood the area. They just had to do some repairs. At least that's the official historical account tells us. Although then a couple years later, they said the Blue Earth County ruled that the dam should be rebuilt or torn down due to concerns over the impact of collapse. Then in 1983, they talk about doing a retrofit, and they even have the temerity to say it didn't meet the wondrous standards of the 1980s. Yeah, right. Because we have so many incredible infrastructure projects that the United States did during the 1980s. Yeah, indeed. Sure. Okay. Whatever you say. And we had all these great standards. Yes. Well, then just this last summer, literally just a couple months ago, June 25th, the dam collapsed. And it should be noted that the dam collapsed after they did this retrofit. And so you really have to ask what exactly was really behind all this. And of course, this caused all sorts of issues all the way down the river and through Minnesota and a lot of flooding. Although it should also be noted that downriver further in Iowa, there really wasn't any flooding. So what to make of this? And going back to the question of how much of this infrastructure from the old world do we still depend on? I mean, we might think it's only about 50%, but I think it's a lot more than we'd like to think. And you really have to wonder, did we meddle with it? Did we try to actually update it or retrofit it for some reason? Or do we just not even have the capacity to maintain it? I mean, these are all the kind of questions that we need to ask because I think this is a lot more common than we realize. Oh, and I would just like to give a call out here to the Rapidan Dam Cafe and Store. I've actually been there, and it is sad because they were known for their homemade pies. Really, really good pies. So, in any event, hope you enjoyed this, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Greetings, Prime Explorers, and today we're going to explore the mystery of the mission of the Scorpion. Submarines and underwater craft. It's always been an interesting technological consideration that supposedly reached its apex in World War I and World War II with the U-boat threat. And yet to this very day, technological aspects are focused on continuing to develop and advance submarines, or so we're told. Today we're going to look at the strange account, though, of the disappearance of 4 submarines, all within 1 year during the height of the Cold War in 1968. I'm also going to share what is likely an anecdote about what really transpired with these submarines. Let's begin. So while you may not be familiar with this account, or you may be familiar with it if you're into military history or you've studied the great Cold War conflict concerning the submarine warfare that occurred, the USS Scorpion was a United States attack submarine, nuclear-powered, that disappeared in early 1968. It was one of 4 submarines that disappeared from 4 different nations, to include the Soviet Union, Israel, and France. All 4 of these submarines disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1968. The Scorpion was considered the first, or at least the first widely known. What's interesting is the Scorpion was a skipjack-class attack submarine, one of the most advanced in the world, at least that's what the official account tells us. And what we're told is that the Scorpion was conducting trials, it was on patrol, and it was tasked to shadow a couple of Soviet surface vessels. And during that mission, it mysteriously sunk. Now, there was an official investigation by the United States Navy, and they ascertained that the Scorpion sunk due to some sort of mechanical failure, either involving a hydrogen explosion or a rogue torpedo that it fired, or one of its own torpedoes detonating. However, there are other accounts that say, and this is where we start to get into the crazy mentality, at least that's what we'll be told, I don't think it's crazy, that the Scorpion was sunk by Soviet naval forces, that it was indeed trailing, because at that time, again according to the official account, the Soviet intelligence had a vast superiority on the United States intelligence with what was called the Walker Spy Ring. The Walker Spy Ring was a group of U.S. Naval Service members that were on the payroll for the KGB, and they were providing intelligence to the Soviet Union at the time on the movements of the United States Navy, to include its submarine force. However, it's a very odd account. So that's the USS Scorpion. At the exact same time frame, the K-129, a Soviet nuclear submarine, also went down in the same year. And then there was a report that the United States recovered it in a secret CIA operation, which of course was disclosed and everybody knows about. So, when something's disclosed and everybody knows about it, how secret is it truly? Now, what's odd about this is the K-129 sunk in a completely different location than the Scorpion. And indeed, these other submarines we're going to look at all sunk in unique locations. So the loss of the K-129, the loss of the Scorpion, an American and a Soviet submarine going down in very different areas of the land, almost on opposite sides of the globe, if you follow me. So, the French Minerve, another submarine that went down in 1968. Now, France during that time was in a very diplomatically challenged place, as it was not going to be an official member of NATO, although it was suspected that if the Soviet Union attacked the Western European forces in NATO, that France would eventually join it, although France has always had a unique political history. So here we have a submarine from a nation that is not officially participating in the Cold War, and yet at the same time, along with the United States and the Soviet Union, it was a signatory of the Antarctica Treaty. Why am I bringing that up? That comes into play in a moment. So again, another mysterious sinking of a submarine that was unaccounted for many years, and then recent disclosed files, and if you read on how difficult it was to disclose these files of this French submarine, you find that there's a lot of mystery involved in it. And they even admit it right here. It was a string of deadly disasters involving military submarines around the world during the 1960s. Well, during 1968. 4 submarines all going down. This is the 3rd one. And then finally, the last one, Israel's lost submarine Dakar, which again sunk and was lost in 1968, about the same time frame as the Scorpion. Quite fascinating, isn't it? And even more fascinating that the efforts to recover and tell the story of this Israeli submarine is held about in the United States Library of Congress. Well, make of that what you will. And now here's where the story really gets crazy. According to some unofficial accounts, and I want to make this very clear that these are indeed unofficial accounts, and that this is actually an anecdote from a former member of a senior military service in the United States. Now, I can't exactly disclose the identity of this individual, and I will say that this is just a story. There is really no way to verify this. However, when you compare some of the facts that were released about this and what was really going on, there's some really strange aspects that line up about this story. Now, what's the source of the story? It was actually an unofficial article that was once disclosed from an aspect of investigations that was occurring in the early 2000s concerning what was supposed to be vast disclosures about operations during the Cold War. One of the legends of the Cold War, and it is indeed a legend, is that there were all these crazy near collisions and life-altering incidences that occurred between the submarines that were shadowing each other, the hunter-killers shadowing ballistic missile submarines during the Cold War on both sides. There were many near collisions, many accidents, and a lot of hand-pointing and finger-pointing about what was actually going on. At the end of the day, though, the account of these 4 submarines has a very different story, and here's what it is. The actual account was that these 4 submarines were not operating separately, but were actually on a joint mission, where all 4 of them were operating together on the same mission. Now, this is very, very difficult to prove, and it's certainly something that you can't find any official account towards. So it could just be a story. But how it goes is that the Scorpion was the flagship of this little flotilla of submarines that was sent to an unknown restricted area that only submarines can access. And why is it we continue to develop submarines when they seem to be very antiquated technology, and when we have things such as drones and other aspects of underwater submarine countermeasures, they seem like they would be outdated, and yet we still spend billions or more on developing submarines across the land. And yet these 4 submarines were sent on a special mission to an undisclosed location to access technology that had been discovered during an earlier expedition of submarines. Now, what area of land are we talking about? We're talking about the Antarctica, of course, because it was the exploration by U-boats that had actually acquired access to this particular area. Now, the specific location is not known. However, this account gets even more troubling when we look at some of the connections. Now, what this all came from was the German claim on New Swabia, as they called it, in Antarctica in the early 1940s, although the German expeditions that looked at this area were launched around 1939. Of course, who knows how much more extensively they were involved. As the story goes, these German submarines had found an access point underwater that enabled them to reach a special area where, according to extravagant claims, there was remaining technology either from an earlier civilization or something that couldn't specifically be identified. Now, this is probably where a lot of the claims about extraterrestrials, or maybe we should even call them extracelestials, depending on how you want to look at the shape or the nature of the land. I don't know. These are all elaborate claims. But when you consider this one surviving claim of these 4 submarines from 4 different nations that all disappeared at the exact same time frame, and then the official account puts them in very different areas of the land, and they all sunk under very mysterious conditions. Now, they even admit that there could have been some hostile action, especially with the American and the Soviet submarine. However, the extreme account that all 4 of these submarines went in the same area and accessed this potential area of technology endures. Now, it's very hard to find any sort of documentation of this, surprise, surprise, as we know that to keep secrets, you simply have to eliminate all documentation and you have to eliminate all knowledge of it. And it's a lot easier to do than you might think, especially when you consider how easy it is to put out a lot of misinformation. And then even when you publish the misinformation, you can even have extravagant accounts within that misinformation and have people focused on that. What survives about the account, though, is the 4 submarines went to this area, they accessed this technology, but something terrible happened. Something had gotten into the crew, and it was reported that these submarines actually had to be sunk by another force because somehow the crew was compromised in a way that's not widely known. Now, this sounds like some sort of science fiction horror story where some sort of unknown life form, some sort of virus, or something we don't understand compromised the crew. We don't know for sure. What we do know from the account, though, was that the 4 submarines were sunk by their own respective navies, and cover stories were issued. At least that's what this account claims. Even more disturbingly, though, is another portion of the account which claims that the crews were in fact not compromised, but were sunk because of the knowledge of what they had witnessed on this special mission. And in fact, the only submarine of these 4 that was ever contacted on the surface by their navy was the Scorpion. It seems that the Scorpion had the mission to recover whatever piece of technology that was down in this particular area. And when they brought it back, this was the technology that was spread to the land and the true holders of power. Now consider this. What major technological developments occurred after 1968? I'm not going to answer the question for you in this exploration because if you look at it, it suddenly becomes very disturbingly obvious. It's also even more obvious with how the direction of technological developments changed very rapidly, and it connects back to our exploration that we did in the 1980s. But again, this is an exploration for prime explorers. This may just simply be theory, conjecture, and speculation. This may just be a wild story that just happens to connect. And yet, this account is out there, and it did originate from an individual who was supposedly a member of the National Security Agency in the late 1960s. Now, there's been plenty of other disclosures from members of the US government that haven't amounted to anything, so take it with a grain of salt. But I leave it to you, Prime Explorers. What are your thoughts on this account of these 4 submarines from different nations that all just happened to disappear in 1968, and this continued connection with this technological development? And also when you look at the official chronology of what developments occurred after 1968. It's a lot of mysteries with few answers, as many other things are. But I wanted to relay it to you. I want to make sure that this account just doesn't simply end, because who knows? There may be other disclosures of information, or we may have other events that transpire that give us a hint that perhaps what happened with these 4 submarines is closer to this, how shall we say, extravagant account that we have. Well, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the Desert Southwest Enigmas, the Old World Hidden. Today we're going to be taking a look at some enigmas in the Southwest United States, which is also called the Desert Southwest. Specifically, we'll be looking at 2 locations in New Mexico and the mighty Grand Canyon in Arizona. We start with our overall picture of our state capitals across the United States, and we see that most states have many beautiful and ornate, remarkable domes, and some other states have incredible towers. There's not a state capitol building that seems as though it's left wanting in terms of what kind of beauty and opulence that it conveys. Although it can be said that some states seem to have smaller, more modest state capitals, such as the state of Nevada, whatever you want to call it. And then the state of Oregon, they have a very interesting capital, although it looks like a newer capital. But when we look across this, we see one, especially in the continental United States, that really stands out. And that's the capital of New Mexico. And why is that? Well, it happens to be one of the newer state capitals. And I'm sure you're wondering, well, wait a minute, if it's a newer state capital, why does it seem so modest and not have the grand glory and opulence of great capitol domes or mighty towers that other capitals do? Well, we look here comparing all of our amazing American capitals through the years, and we see that originally there was a different type of dome that was supposedly on these state capitol buildings. Looking at the United States Capitol in Washington in 1818, we see there was a very different dome, allegedly. We see that some of these buildings were more modest, but we know from our previous explorations that we've seen many wondrous buildings that were built during this time and even before. So it's hard to say. But we go down through the years and we see perhaps an evolution or a de-evolution. It's as though it started with one style in the early 1800s, and then by the late 1800s, they were just going with domes everywhere that they could, bringing out remarkable state capitals and producing them very easily, in addition to many mighty county courthouses too, in sparsely populated and scattered state areas. No real challenge. But then when we get to the 20th century, we see the early 20th century, still we have the mighty domes. But then it's once we get past what seems to be the Art Deco period. Now, of course, they'll still show us the Washington or the Washington federal capital of the United States, but that was a renovation. Yet these other ones, we see something very different. And there it is, the Santa Fe, state capital of New Mexico. Just a round building with nothing quite so incredible about it. What's the story behind this state capital in New Mexico? Well, in Santa Fe in 1886, a new building replaced the antiquated Palace of the Governors as the territorial capital. May 12, 1892, a fire began and destroyed the structure, though bystanders were able to save most of the archives, books, and furniture. The building was uninsured, and its loss cost the territory over $200,000. So here we go again, another one of these pesky fires. And you look at this incredible building, and it looked like it was a 2-dome capitol building, although a little bit more modest in size than we're used to seeing, certainly a building that defies simple explanation in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We'll go down and take a look at what remains of the so-called Palace of the Governors, although there's really not much to see with it. So I was trying to figure out exactly what the origin of the state capitals in New Mexico truly was. And this was just a territorial capital, and of course we didn't have it insured, and of course $200,000 lost. The next Capitol building, designed by Isaac Rapp, was not completed until 1900. And here it looks like we have a more traditional Capitol building with a classic rotunda dome, our nice little Roman Forum appearance, and our good old columns. After the costly loss of the previous building, the new Capitol was completed on a shoestring budget of less than $140,000, using salvage materials and unpaid convict labor from the penitentiary of New Mexico to save money. So you see, you can just grab labor from anywhere and they can build an amazing, remarkable building. What happened to this state capitol? Why do we not still have this? Does this building still stand? In 1950, a major project was begun to unify the architectural appearance of all the buildings in the government complex to the so-called territorial revival style. Oh, we've got a real doozy for you on this one with the territorial revival style, too. Here we go. So this is what remains of the state capitol building that we just looked at, converted to the Baton Memorial Building. Very, very modest, and really the only thing that shows you that this was once a more elegant building is these windows here. Incredible. Yes, and this is what we have now for our wondrous state capitol in Santa Fe. Built in 1966. You know, if you were a resident of New Mexico, you might have reason to complain that you don't have an elaborate, ornate state capitol, at least with a dome on it. I mean, how are you supposed to know that you're living in a land that is supposed to be the purveyor of democracy? Although, again, as we're fond of saying, the United States is not technically a democracy, it's a constitutional federal republic. Regardless, we move on, and we look at this building from an aerial view, and we just see how modest it is, and yet this is one of the more recent state capitals. Why is this not a more elaborate building? Was New Mexico being more understanding in terms of what they needed for government functions, and they didn't need a remarkable palace building with domes? It's an interesting question to ask. But what is it with this territorial revival style? I think we need to get on the ground and take a look at things in Santa Fe and see exactly what it looks like. What did it look like? Well, here's our bird's eye view of Santa Fe in New Mexico. And the intriguing thing about Santa Fe is that it's a little bit off the beaten path. One would expect Albuquerque to be the state capital of New Mexico, if things developed as we're told. Of course, we have the usual story. Well, Santa Fe was the original territorial capital. It has a long history, so naturally it continued as the territorial capital and became the state capital. Got some amazing buildings here. Now, right here, this is the central little pavilion park area. And then over here, you have what's supposedly the territorial capital of the governors. Intriguing across the board. Also intriguing with some of these other buildings. We see some larger buildings, and of course we still have this incredible two-towered cathedral. Well, they'll probably say it's a basilica or something more modest. And this is an incredible building over here. Let's see if we have any photographs. Now, this is a photograph of this pavilion park. Date unknown. And here we have what looks to be like a little gazebo or something. And then looks like just dirt paths leading to it, although there's a nice geometry to it. Then we see a later photo, supposedly from the 1870s, and they've established this beautiful obelisk. And again, it looks like these are just dirt paths. And we still have this building back here. These photos have a strange quality to them, and we're told that these are official photos of Santa Fe. And then this is something from the early 20th century, exact date unknown. And even if they gave me a date, I'm not sure I'd trust it. And we see this incredible obelisk, and we see people walking about and wondering, oh, well, at least we got our little gazebo back. You know, you need to have a gazebo down there in the sun a lot. It looks like there's still dirt paths. Very intriguing. We have to wonder if there's more of a mystery here. So it starts with looking at New Mexico overall as a state, and we see that Albuquerque is clearly the main city, the largest city by population, and one would expect it to be the state capital. However, the Palace of the Governors was the original territorial capital and had been for quite some time. And that is why It was located in Santa Fe. And we see that that pavilion's still there. Let's see what it looks like now. So this is the Palace of the Governors. Let's take a look on the ground. Very, very modest. Really not much there that would ever give you an indication that that's any kind of state capital or territorial capital in the past. Interesting brick streets. And then here's that pavilion that we saw. And it looks like that obelisk is still there. Of course, it has a little fence around it now. And it looks like they have gone forward and paved those walkways. Although, who knows? Maybe they were paved in the past and they were just covered in the dirt. It's hard to say. And you look around and you see a very modest appearance to Santa Fe. Now, this is what would be called territorial revival style. And this was another one of these brilliant architectural movements that came about in the 1930s. So during the Great Depression, when there was an abundance of funds and labor and people were very happy in the United States, or so we're told, and they decided to convert all the buildings in Santa Fe to this incredible appearance. Gotta say, I think it's to give the idea, and you look it up and they'll even tell you that territorial revival style was to give the idea that there was a different kind of culture here, although we see that's not the case when we look at the older state capitals of New Mexico. Well, this isn't cultural appropriation, this is cultural appreciation. There's a very subtle difference. One is okay, and one is not. Clearly we're looking at one that's okay. I don't know, I'm not particularly fond of this territorial revival style. It actually gives the town a very, dare I say, artificial feeling to it. I mean, even the territorial capital, the Palace of the Governors, what's palatial about this? Stranger and stranger. Well, I think that's it for looking in on Santa Fe for now, but certainly much more of an exploration to be done here. Just wanted to broach the topic and share my thoughts with you. Let's go to our next topic. Let's move on to our next enigma in the desert Southwest, and the one I wanted to focus on is Shiprock in New Mexico. Now, this particular terrain anomaly has been the focus of many other researchers, and I just wanted to cover it to give my 2 cents on it. One of the interesting aspects of this supposed anomaly is that it's what they would call a monadnock, or however you want to pronounce it. In any event, it's merely a protrusion from flat terrain of a very, very large, singular, and isolated mountain. And of course, there is an explanation to this, that this is a volcano, or it was a volcano. Although every time I saw it, I have to admit, it reminded me of the Black Fortress from the 1983 science fiction fantasy movie Kroll. And if you've never seen that movie, give it a chance. It's rather unique. I had no doubt that the fortress in Kroll was designed and inspired by Shiprock in New Mexico. And if you haven't seen the movie Kroll, the concept behind the Black Fortress, as they called it in the movie, is it was the home of the Beast, who was the antagonist in this fantasy movie. And the fortress could fly from planet to planet, and it could fly across the land. It could also disappear and reappear in different places. So it was quite mobile. And I wondered if there was something that connected to Shiprock, because when you look at Shiprock, it just looks like it would be a fortress that was established out there. Now we'll get this wonderful scientific diagram that'll show us how this original volcano came about and how weathering and erosion removed the volcano and then just left sedimentary rock, and the volcanic neck was still in place, and that's what makes Shiprock to this day. This is a really bizarre sketch. I mean, we're saying that all of this terrain was removed by natural erosion? Strange. Who would even make a diagram like this? Oh, I had to ask. I'm so glad that you asked. I've been missing my presence on your channel, and when I saw today that you were looking at actual science, I thought that I would chip in. Well, good, Carl. I'm glad, because this is part of our contract, and this is where you are supposed to chip in. So, please, explain to us, what's the concept behind this? Well, it's quite simple. You had an original volcano millions and millions of years ago, and the volcano gradually eroded away. Weathering and erosion removed the volcano, and as you can see, it left merely a shiprock, a volcanic neck, and that is what leaves this mighty structure that you call a monadnock, and that you incorrectly present to your audience as being some sort of old fortress. I can assure you it is no fortress. It's a fact. It really happened. It was natural erosion. And that's the end of the discussion. Okay, Carl, and does this apply to other aspects as well? I mean, do you have a diagram for other wonderful terrain features that I've talked about? Yes, of course. We have one for Devil's Tower, too. And you see, this beautiful diagram can show you how Devil's Tower was formed. It wasn't any absurd myth. It wasn't any giant tree of life. It was merely formed naturally from the terrain, and erosion and volcanic activity. You see, volcanoes can do amazing things, and they're always there to establish what we need. They're always there to provide wondrous sights in our amazing natural world. Okay, Carl, I think you're kind of losing me there. What's this, Giant's Causeway? Yes, another aspect of volcanic activity. But there doesn't appear to be any kind of volcano there in Ireland with Giant's Causeway. I actually kind of like the Fionn McCool legend that he constructed Giant's Causeway. That is just totally absurd. You have to understand that this is the effects of nature. It is a volcano and its natural erosion. It is nothing more. Do not look too far into the fact that these structures seem artificial. They are not. They are the effects of natural forces. That is what we see, and that is what I know to be true. It's a fact. It really happened. All right, thank you very much, Carl. I think that'll be enough for today. Really? You want me to go? Yes. You've said your piece, and I think it's time we move on. Let's take a look at Shiprock and how it looks on the terrain in New Mexico. And we see that the incredible rock fortress, which is what I see when I look at it. Now, I could be wrong. It really could just be the result of erosion and the remnants of a volcano, although I just find that hard to believe. Especially when you look at these two walls that seem to protrude from the fortress itself. It almost gives the aspect of it being some sort of tactical application. Imagine if this were some kind of fortress in the distant past, and these were walls as some sort of defense. I look at that and I can't help but see it. Again, could be wrong. The walls just don't make any sense. Let's see what we see from the ground. This is a nice little aerial image here. So here we have the top of the Shiprock Formation. Again, it does have a very fortress-like appearance. And we see bases like this with many castles and other eroded structures. And earlier this week, when I was doing the joint exploration with Old World Exploration, we saw the same thing with the castles and the buildings we looked at in Cappadocia and other locations. And yet here you just have this wall that runs off, going to the south. And then this other wall running out to the west. Very remarkable. And you have to wonder what this was. And I certainly invite in the comments, what do you think Shiprock is or was? Was this the result of a volcano and natural erosion, or was this an artificial structure? A tremendous fortress with walls built off it. And we think to our earlier explorations this week, and we wonder about the remnants of the old world. And could this be a true old world remnant that's just hidden right in the terrain that we're told is a natural terrain feature? It's incredible, and it definitely warrants much more exploration behind it. And now we go to Arizona to look at our final enigma of the desert Southwest, and we focus on the Grand Canyon. We know there is a lot of mystery with the Grand Canyon that's natural, coming from the early 20th century when we had reports of a supposed Smithsonian expedition that found Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. We're told that that's merely the result of phony journalism. I always find it rich when the mainstream says that journalism was phony at one point in time. However, it does add to the mystery of the Grand Canyon. In addition to the limited access areas, the airspace control, which is very critical in the area, you have to wonder, what are we looking at when we look at the Grand Canyon? The names, even the names of the major terrain features. It just feels like Shiprock, only on a grander scale. Here with the Shiva Temple, the Isis Temple, and the Cheops Pyramid. Now, of course, we'll be told again, it's the forces of nature, it's natural erosion, water, and the results of millions of years of these forces that crafted these amazing pieces of terrain. However, I want to take a closer look on the ground and see exactly what it looks like. So I'm thinking that a future exploration is going to involve getting back on the ground in the Grand Canyon, because I think that's the only way to look at this. Now, of course, wanting to fly your drone down there is a very difficult proposition as well. But even being able to see at some distance with some binoculars and getting some better footage could be useful for some analysis. Just looking at this picture right now, we can see so many near artificial features when we see these angles and the way that a lot of these aspects are cut down. We are reminded of grand pyramids and temples. So they were just named that because that's what they looked like. They didn't want to call them some mighty hill or incredible mountain or mesa or something of that effect. I mean, we're in the Grand Canyon. It's supposed to have been carved by the Colorado River. So what's exactly going on here? I don't know, but I find this to be a very alluring mystery. And it certainly doesn't make it any easier when we consider the limited access that is a facet with the Grand Canyon. Let's take a look and see what we can learn from imagery and what's available to us on imagery. One thing that always stood out to me about the Grand Canyon is just how it seems to be almost a locally isolated terrain feature. If this was carved by the Colorado River, then why don't we have more Grand Canyons out there? Well, I'm sure there's a good scientific explanation for it. But we're not interested in that right now. Let's take a look at Cheops Pyramid and see if we can go to 3D. And again, we see quite an amazing piece of terrain out there. Now, is this terrain or could this be something much more? I just have trouble believing that this was all created and carved by a single river. Now, there could be another amazing explanation for this. This could be natural terrain that was created by some other force that we don't fully understand now. It's just believing that this is all done by a river. I'm not sure. And it's something that comes up when you do these kind of explorations. Sometimes you have something that stares you in the face and you look at it and, well, am I looking at something that's natural or does this look like something that's artificial? And this seems to happen a lot when you look at spectacular pieces of terrain like this. And what doesn't make any sense to me is, so what happened? The river just ran all around this, just like Castle Rock in Wisconsin, and it just left this little piece here, and then it fine carved the rest of this down here? Or is it possible that this could be an incredible melted structure? That this was some amazing remnants of one of the earlier eras, perhaps the first or the second era, and we're just seeing what's left of it after the reset, if you will. It's very intriguing to consider, and there's a lot of mystery when you look through and around the Grand Canyon. You have to wonder. And of course, I invite your feedback. What do you think? Is this just a natural terrain feature, or is there something much more to the Grand Canyon? Is there something hidden here? Is there something that's right in front of our eyes that we don't see because we just see natural terrain? It's a very intriguing premise. Well, thank you for joining me today. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be looking into the riddle of steel, understanding the history and the meaning of swords, and how they could relate back to the old world and an older civilization. What meanings do swords have for us, both in our mainstream history and in our understanding of what an alternate history could be? Swords do have a powerful meaning, and they endure in many legends and myths, and even in many movies to this day. And yet the mainstream will tell us that this is just a romantic notion. We're going to look at 4 real examples of swords, and then we're going to discuss how they could tie back into the power and the old world that swords once wielded. The first sword we're going to take a look at is the Sword of Goujian. This ancient sword lay in a waterlogged tomb for 2,500 years, but managed to remain relatively untarnished and impressively sharp. Let's see what the mainstream has to tell us about this remarkable artifact. In 1965, an archaeological team discovered a series of ancient tombs along an aqueduct of the Zhang River Reservoir in Jingzhou, China. They discovered more than 2,000 artifacts, but none were more impressive or surprising than the sword of Gujian. The archaeologists found the sword lying next to a human skeleton in a water-damaged casket. The whole tomb was sodden, having been soaked in underground water for more than 1,000 years. So when the team unsheathed the sword from its wooden scabbard, no one was expecting to see such a pristine artifact. The scabbard, with its black lacquer finish, provided an almost airtight fit around the ancient sword. Thanks to this and the chemical composition of the sword, the magnificent blade was almost untarnished and retained an impressively sharp edge. The edge has frequently been described as razor sharp, but that could well be an exaggeration, of course. The Department of Culture described the blade as easily cutting through 20 pieces of hard paper. That sounds like a pretty sharp sword. The state of preservation was made all the more impressive when the sword was dated to the spring and autumn period of Chinese history, which ran approximately from 771 to 403 BC. That meant that the blade was around 2,500 years old and placed it in a period of epic Chinese heroes, many of whom have taken on an almost mythical status in Chinese culture. The sword is a total length of 22 inches, 55.6 centimeters, with a 3.3 inch, 8.4 centimeter hilt. The exquisitely forged blade was made primarily of copper, but the edges have a higher tin content, making them harder and able to keep a sharper edge. Remarkable technology for that time frame from the historical narrative. Both sides of the blade are decorated with a repeating rhombi pattern, their dark lines standing out from the sword's overall golden hue. The guard, meanwhile, is inlaid with blue crystals and turquoise. On one side of the blade are 8 characters engraved in what is known as bird worm seal script. 6 of these ancient characters have been deciphered. The script reads, King of Yu, and made the sword for his personal use. The other 2 characters could not be identified, but analysts believe that they state the name of the aforementioned King of Yu. These intriguing details provoked much debate as to the owner of the sword. 9 kings had ruled Yu during the period attributed to the sword, making identifying one as the true owner no easy task, of course. But after studying both the sword and the tomb for many months, archaeologists, historians, and Chinese linguists came to a consensus. The sword belonged to Gujian, who ruled the kingdom of Yu from 496 to 465 BC. I wonder how they came to that conclusion. Gujian was known for his perseverance in times of hardship and for relinquishing the trappings of his kingly position. He supposedly ate a diet more suitable for a peasant and sometimes ate bile to remind himself of the humiliation he once suffered as a captive of the state of Wu. So it seems reasonable, really, that a king who chose to eat slop and bile at least deserved a fancy sword. Let's take a look. And we see what a remarkable blade and the rhombi pattern that they discussed. And we really have to wonder, how could a sword like this have endured so long with such beauty and still retain such sharpness? Of course, the article walks it back a little bit, telling us that the sharpness may be exaggerated. But when you look at the beauty of this weapon, it's an incredible consideration to realize that it did survive waterlogged for over 1,000 years, and it looks like this. And you can still see it in the museum today. But what is really hidden in the details in this blade? Is this the exact story of this sword? Or does it have a different story behind it? How could technology be available back then that would endure to this day? It's very difficult for us to imagine us crafting something now that would last 1,000, 2,000 years and retain such a pristine condition. Remarkable artifact, and if it's true, it definitely reflects the legacy of the capability of human beings. It might be far older than we could possibly imagine. Consider that. What do you think about this particular sword? Let me know in the comments. And our next sword, Art, coronation sword and scabbard of the kings of France. Although studies suggest that it is comprised of parts created between the 10th and 13th centuries, this sword has long been known as La Joyeuse, or the Sword of Charlemagne. This is intriguing to me because I've done a lot of research on the historical character of Charlemagne, and to say that Charlemagne's existence is questionable is being complimentary. From 768 until 814, the year of his death, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was king of the Franks. He was also from 800 on the first of the Holy Roman Emperors, later earning the epithet the Father of Europe for the vastness of the lands acquired under his aegis. As early as 1271, this sword was being used in the coronation ceremonies of French kings, who wished to identify themselves as descendants of the exalted ruler of the Franks and leader of Christendom. Over succeeding centuries, the sword was kept along with other royal regalia in the Church of Saint Denis, a major pilgrimage site and the burial place of French kings for over 800 years. Is it Saint Denis or Saint Denis? I just had to do that. On the occasion of a coronation, the sword was brought out and carried to the Reims Cathedral, where it played a vital part in the ritual. During the first part of the ceremony, the sword was presented to the king, Charlemagne's heir, as part of the insignia of knighthood. It was then passed to the commander of the French army, who held it point up for the remainder of the proceedings. As with many ceremonial objects, the sword with its golden handle and gemstone-encrusted scabbard was visually magnificent. It was also laden with historical associations. Though rooted in myth and legend, the history of the sword added to its potency as a symbol of authority. And that's something that we see as a recurring theme with swords, is their symbols of authority. In turn, the appearance of the sword in coronations over the course of hundreds of years reinforced its legitimacy as an object of great antiquity, extraordinary origin, and royal power. French kings made several alliterations to it, including an embroidered velvet sheath added to the scabbard in 1825. So we have the history on this sword, along with a bit of a myth. We have to wonder, is this something else that's far older than we can imagine? Now, I recall research earlier in my life that the blade was not made of steel, but was made of iron, as that's all that was available at the time. Yet, like the sword we just looked at, we see a remarkable artifact, a weapon, that's a symbol of authority, that's managed to survive for many years. Something else that's interesting and makes you wonder what it's really from and what it really alludes to. Now let's look at the Nebra Sky Disc swords. Age or year created, circa 1600 BCE. I always love that BCE. In Nebra, Saxony, Germany. Made of bronze and copper. Very interesting design on these swords, and I don't know, do they really call them swords or are they more daggers? Hard to tell. The Nebra Sky Disc hoard is one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century, a claim backed by the UNESCO Memory of World Register, so we know it must be legitimate. Although the centerpiece of the sword is the sky disc, a beautiful bronze disc inlaid with gold celestial symbols. 2 bronze swords, as well as 2 hatchets, a chisel, and spiral bracelet fragments were also discovered. The bronze swords in the entire hoard were buried between 1600 BCE, but scientists have been unable to date the time of manufacture, meaning the artifacts are probably much older. An intriguing consideration is that this entire find has been under immense controversy for years. And it's another example of the mainstream saying that they back something up, even going so far as to declaring it a UNESCO Memory of World Register, but then questioning the people who allegedly found this hoard. And I remember this coming up in a lot of different research circles, and it was quite interesting how emotional people would come about this research. Who knows whether these swords or daggers really came from this time, or they're much older, or maybe it's a lot closer to our time frame. But it's another example of questioning how people can be so sure of what transpired in years past, if nothing else. These weapons are remarkable in their existence and how they appear, but could they mean something else? Could they be alluding to something else? Or does this just give us another example of something which we're not sure on? And I bring this one up before we go to the real focus of this exploration because I think it's important to remember we always need to ask questions. We're never going to be sure, especially when it comes to the past. And now the real focus of this exploration, and naturally we'll go with one of the finest mainstream articles, demystifying the giant Norimitsu Odachi. So they're going to explain it for us. I can't wait to read this. Sword lore. Admittedly, the reason why my friends are into swordsmanship is because of the sword itself. They just want to handle swords, that's all. They don't care about winning competitions or fights. For them, the swords in their hand brings an inexplicable pleasure. There's sort of a romance surrounding these weapons that others don't have. Most, that is. I say this because I've heard that polearms also have their place in other cultures, and that the dagger has become symbolic in modern militaries. News to me. It's a matter of preferences, and the cultures that preferred the sword have a collection of stories and legends attached to the weapon. What the samurai, medieval knights, and other warrior societies have in common is their blade lore. The sword is an important piece of their arsenal, even though there are more superior tools in their inventory, like pole arms and firearms. And going back to the samurai, some of the legends surrounding their weapons persist up to this day. Their blade lore is kept alive by the constant stream of films and anime to the point where everything is exaggerated. And one sword in Japan seems to take the word exaggeration to new lengths. Kept in a shrine somewhere in Okayama is a monstrous Japanese sword that stirred the imaginations of first-time observers. Okay, so they're saying it stirred the imaginations of first-time observers. I mean, it would stir anybody's imagination. Why would you have a sword this large? The Ahiko Jinja Shinto Shrine in Nashikambara District, Nagita Prefecture, Japan, is dedicated to the deity, the dawn goddess, and also the goddess of meditation, mirth, and arts. But within its walls and mounted behind a glass display is a curious and imposing object. It's a sword, and a rather monstrous one, you think? Some Japanese swords required two hands to wield, but the sword of the Ikachu Jinjo Shrine would require superhuman strength. The sword had a name, Niramitsu Odachi, named after its maker Niramitsu Osafune. The weapon dates back to the Muromachi period and was forged in August 1446 in the province of Bishu. Again, they have a very exact history. They know exactly when it was done. And at a length of 3.77 meters, it will dwarf any sword in its class, even some Western swords. Oh, do we have Western swords that are even larger than this? Show them. Not only that it is huge, but it is also heavy. Forged from a single piece of steel, the weapon weighs 14.5 kilos, far heavier than modern rifles, and obviously quite a lot for even trained warriors. The fact that it dwarfed average humans tickled the imaginations of people who admired its monumental scale. Obviously, even highly trained samurai won't carry such a monster on the battlefield. Oh, why not? They would develop shoulder pain before they could even chop down their enemies, and any object weighing more than 10 kilos will tire the poor wielder. Because of this, people began to wonder why such a large Odachi was forged and who would use such a contraption. The only answer people could come up with was a supernatural one. A large weapon requires great strength, and great strength correlates to great size, and only creatures of great size and strength could swing such a weapon. Hence, the Norimitsu Odachi was intended for giants, at least as some people say. The presence of a large weapon is evidence enough for some people to believe in a race of gigantic beings. Japanese mythology often features gigantic creatures, like the local version of the Western ogre Oni. Could it be that such legends were inspired by real life? Perhaps people of Japan back in the olden times really were aware of the existence of gigantic beings. The gigantic sword was intended for their use. Oh, here we go. But there was a problem with this theory. Firstly, the notion that the Norimitsu Odachi once belonged to a giant was recent and not an ancient legend. We could say that the restless users of the internet gave birth to such an idea, and the truth behind this massive bladed weapon is quite underwhelming. I see. So when people saw this in the past, the thought that it could have once belonged to giants never once crossed their mind. Obviously, it's something with the internet, and it's something with people who are actually questioning things that they couldn't possibly be right. So what's the truth that's so underwhelming about this massive bladed weapon? The Norimitsu Odachi belongs to a class of Japanese swords known as the Odachi, obviously. Most Westerners often associate the samurai with a katana, but throughout history the samurai wielded several sword variants. Preceding the katana is a type of sword known as the tachi, whereas a blade longer than the tachi, the Odachi, was widely used back in the Ninbako Cho period. In Japan, means great, while dachi is another variant of the word tachi, meaning sword. Hence we have the Odachi, the great sword. Indeed, the sword could reach 70 inches, as in the case of Usagi Kenshin's men, while the Rikishi's troops of the Asakura clan carried 60-inch Odachi. Okay, where's the explanation? One might wonder what the idea behind the extra long swords was. Here we go. According to some historical texts, the Odachi was the weapon of foot soldiers and was more of a battlefield weapon. The great length of the sword gave the soldiers the reach advantage of a polearm, so the sword could be used as an anti-cavalry weapon as well. The preferred technique was the downward cut. The Odachi was also used to show off an army's strength, both as a morale booster for the user and as a form of intimidation. But carrying such a large weapon presented unique challenges. You think? Okay, I still don't see any explanation here. The maker, Norimitsu Osafune, simply wanted to make a statement. Of course. He wanted to show off how good he was by crafting such an object. That would be totally useless, and would be a complete waste of material and his time. Forging a Japanese sword was no easy feat and took years to master, and forging an even bigger sword was harder. For one thing, a normal sized sword already required complex forging techniques, and an extra blade length meant added complications, simply more work and hammering for the blacksmith. The longer metal was also harder to heat into homogeneous temperature. Then there was the quenching. In a normal sized sword, one will dip the blazing blade into a pool of water. Nodachi needed a larger quenching medium, and who knows what size Norimitsu Usafani used for his monster sword. So they're admitting that it's difficult to have achieved this. Lastly is the sharpening and polishing. Obviously, one can't apply the normal polishing method, rubbing the blade over a stone, to such an object. And Nodachi was hung or placed in a fixed position during polishing as the artisan did their work. And it seems the physical labor paid off, as Norimitsu Osafune gained lasting recognition for his sword, and whoever commissioned the work must be really wealthy, for forging such an object was expensive. There you go. A very rational explanation. It was simply done to show the amazing things that they could do. I don't know. Maybe if you achieve such great wealth, you could have yourself a car that's made that's, 10 times the size of your regular car that you could never actually use, but you could show off this monster vehicle that's completely useless to you. Makes complete sense to me. I don't know. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. So, after looking at these four supposedly historical swords with their assigned timelines, we have to wonder, what's the reality behind these swords? Why is it the mainstream always seems to fall into the theme that they want to disconnect us from our myth and our legends? They're always quick to dismiss them, and they always say that they have a very scientifically understood explanation for what the reality is, even though they're constantly revising what the timelines are and what the so-called dating of these remarkable artifacts truly is. We look back into the Sword of Light, one of the treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, and we think to how the Sword of Light could very well have inspired Excalibur, the Sword of Power, featured in the movie of the same title. And I always found it intriguing that the most notable and the best mythical movie about King Arthur was actually called Excalibur, and not something else. I also find it interesting that the Sword of Light, which was featured in the George R.R. Martin A Song of Ice and Fire, or Lightbringer, had such amazing powers to it as well. What do these swords really provide? What could they have provided to the old world? We think of the example of He-Man, with his sword of power that enabled his transformation from the mild-mannered Adam to the powerful He-Man. And He-Man in and of itself requires additional exploration because there's so many things in the world of Eternia that show connections to the old world. And it has been covered by other explorers, and it's something I intend to cover soon in the future. We look at the Sword of Omens from the Thundercats animated series. And of course, I'm talking about the Thundercats from the 1980s. And all the remarkable powers that it gave Lion-O, such as the sight beyond sight. And we think about that within the sword. What does it really represent, these powers? They'll tell us that these are just animated tales and these are just elaborate fantasy. And yet, all these ideas were inspired from somewhere. And we look at the example of Albion, the named sword, one of the 7 swords of Wayland that was carried by both Robin of Locksley and Robert of Huntington in the Robin of Sherwood TV series, which in my humble opinion is one of the very best adaptations of the Robin Hood legend because it contains the most connections to the old world. We'll be covering that in detail in a future video. Supposedly, Albion was an original name for the lands of Great Britain, and it was one of the most powerful swords, although the swords of Wayland had unique powers. Albion was the sword that gave the designation to both Robin of Locksley and Robert of Huntington as the Hooded Man. The choice of Hern's son to fight for justice and wielding the powers of light and dark. There was even an episode called The 7 Swords of Wayland, where all of these swords were sought out by a corrupt nun who was attempting to bring back the Lord of Darkness, or Lucifer, to the world, in a 2-part episode of Robin of Sherwood called The Swords of Wayland. It's an incredible series that we have with many different histories behind swords. What power do they represent, and why are they so tied into our myth and our legend? I invite you in the comments to let me know what you think about the veracity of the historical account of the swords that we reviewed. Do you believe that there is more power behind swords? Do you think that there's a reason that they remain with us? The mainstream, of course, will tell us that it's merely a romantic notion and that we're looking towards nostalgic times of past. And yet there are too many legends and there are far too many accounts to simply ignore. Finally, what is the answer to the riddle of steel? The answer to the riddle of steel, as featured in the 1982 movie Conan the Barbarian, is as follows. The real power is in the will. Your will is everything. Your will to do what needs to be done and to achieve your goals. That is the answer to the riddle of steel. And it's something
Welcome, channel members, and I thought I would give you a little introduction to the Atlas Mayor. Why is Aurelian making such a big deal about this atlas? What is so significant about it? I thought a little introduction video available to all channel members would help outline some of the mystery and allure about the Atlas Mayor. The Atlas Mayor is the final version of Jan Blue's atlas, published in Amsterdam between 1662 and 1672, in numerous languages and numerous volumes. It contains 594 maps and around 3,000 pages of text. It was the largest and most expensive book published in the 17th century. There were earlier smaller versions. And we have an account about how Willem Blau, yes, Willem, kind of surprised his last name isn't Defoe, I know I am. Willem and his son, Johan Blau, made a public announcement in an Amsterdam newspaper that they would publish their own full atlas in 1634. Now, if we go off the official history, we think about what a tremendous and stupendous undertaking this must have been. And yet somehow they were able to pull this off. And even after his father's death, it was Johan who continued to rework and expand the atlas, a 3-volume edition published from 1640. The final version of the atlas was published as the Atlas Mayor and contained 594 maps in 11 volumes. The final version of the Atlas Mayor was the largest and most expensive book published in the 17th century. The first volumes were published in 1662, the last volume in 1665. Although Johan continued to rework several volumes, he also started creating a 12-volume Spanish edition. However, only 10 volumes were finished. Now here's where it gets very interesting, and you might recognize some familiar account or story beats, as it were. However, this 9 to 12 volume atlas was only intended to be the first part of a much larger work, which is illustrated by the full title of the atlas. And here it's given, and it translates as Grand Atlas, or Blau's Cosmography, in which are most accurately described Earth, sea, and heaven? So he was actually going to make an atlas that depicted the sea and heaven? Because you should know that Atlas Mayor depicts all of the known lands in grave detail. Now, we've looked at the Urbano Monte map before on this channel, and yet it didn't really encompass everything that this particular Atlas Mayor does encompass in full detail. And of course, the story ends as such. In 1672, fire broke out in the workshop. Johan Blue died the next year, no new editions of his atlases were published, and the family business went bankrupt within a few years. Sound familiar? Now, we're told that the atlas was actually stored in this kind of storage unit. This doesn't exactly seem like it's very conducive to actually make use of an atlas, because you'd like to think that since, it was the age of exploration, or at least the end of it, you still had people who were navigating the sea as the primary means of navigation. They would want atlases that were useful as maps and charts. And yet this doesn't exactly seem conducive to that, maybe. But then when you look at the actual artwork and the maps within this atlas, and you get an idea, and this is just one example, and we have this entire atlas at our disposal, we can see exact details in full rendering of cities, geometrically precise foundation structures, star forts, a very unique idea of what the land may have looked like. Now, this is Holland, it seems, that we're looking at, but what's really intriguing is that this book contains more than just the maps. There's also some very unique artwork and very, very compelling symbolism that we may have seen before. Indeed, in some other works that have become somewhat difficult to publish over time. And who are these figures being depicted? This is a page from the Atlas Mayor, which is filled with artwork such as this. This almost reminds me of the statue of Iowa on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And indeed, many of these figures, are they to represent human beings? Are they to represent human beings in the 1600s? Or do they represent something else entirely? We also see other familiar symbolism and icons, such as the cornucopia. You might remember the cornucopia that we saw surrounding the banisters in the Iowa State Capitol, where we found some reptilian critters scooching around with inside, somewhat concealed. We also see other odd figures here in this depiction. Very strange and very unique. This is just one single picture in this atlas that we're looking at. And then, of course, we see the very beautiful architecture. And so it's as though this atlas gives you a little bit of everything. It gives you very unique maps that are very detailed. It shows you what the supposed composition of the cities were at the time that this atlas was composed, although who knows if that's accurate or not. And it also gives you some very unique and impressive artwork, all in one single work. But what's the true story behind it? Why is it so compelling? Well, it comes down to the fact that it seems as though there was a grand atlas that was in the works. Now, is that really describing earth, sea, and heaven? Or was it describing something more? Because we also have the earlier account, and you will find this in historical documents, and mainstream history and university professors do acknowledge this, that the Blaus actually had access to all the best globes, maps, and instruments at the time. No one really talks about how they did, but the Atlantis appendix to Mercator's Atlas in 1630 is a real document. It did exist. It gives clues and indications that there was much more knowledge that was available. Now, what is my theory on what the Atlas Major really is? And why is it of such significance to us? Well, we looked at the Urbano Monte map in Charts of the Old World in a much earlier exploration back in May of 2023. But when we look at this Atlas Major, we see a much more complete and compelling work. And indeed, we see something that alludes to the old world in ways that we might not even be able to imagine. Is it even possible that they were depicting other lands? Yes, it comes to us and it's translated to us as earth, sea, and heaven. But why is this the Grand Atlas? This was supposed to be the even greater work. What wasn't already depicted in the Atlas Major? Cosmography? What is being described? What would this map have depicted? These are the clues that we have to look into, and I think there are many clues that are left in this Atlas Major. Now, we have the current published version, courtesy of Taschen, but it seems as though they've gone to great lengths to bring about the entire atlas. Now, I have seen images, and at least as far as I can recollect, recordings that are more or less accurate. But I think it's imperative that we do examine this atlas, the artwork, the maps, the charts, in grave detail, to see what answers we can come to about what this atlas was really depicting. And we'll see that it's very clear it does depict the known lands at the time. But was this a work that was from the end of the Fourth Era civilization? Or was this something similar to the Doomsday Book from our prime historical account of the Normans conquering England? Was it something that was made to categorize and catalog all the lands that were now around and what structures remained after the reset? There are many different explanations, but the work itself is very intriguing, and there's a lot of different historical explanations and many different historical theories. Yes, you heard me correctly. There are many theories and thesis statements written about this atlas. So we should consider ourselves fortunate that we have access to a full hard copy, and I'm looking forward to exploring it with you. And if you have any questions or areas of focus you'd like me to look into as we go forward, please let me know. What are your thoughts on this introduction to the Atlas Major? Thank you for joining me.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Greetings, channel members, and today we're going to take our first in-depth look at Atlas Major, and this is the book published by Taschen. I wanted to call attention to the artwork initially. Now, I'm going to run these explorations a little bit differently than we normally do. These are going to be a lot more deliberate. There's going to be many shorter videos that are going to be released on this. Now, for whatever reason, I tend not to do that for the mainstream releases, but it's an advantage we have with the channel member videos. We see in the artwork of the Atlas Major, though, what we're told are idealized human figures, whether we want to call them cherubs or deities or some sort of people from a different era. And yet, oddly enough, we do see people that are supposedly from different portions of the land and from different ethnic backgrounds working together and seeming to have a grand old time. Now, you could say that this is just an idyllic image, but what do some of these things actually represent? Is this just somebody having a great time putting some wonderful art as part of an atlas? Or is this actually an image that's somehow carried over from the previous civilization and was integrated into the atlas to give it a little bit more of an appeal? Now, we have to remember we're not exactly sure what the nature of the society was of the civilization that came before us. Perhaps they had a very stern and sarcastic tone with how they ran their lives, or maybe they were just much more carefree. And indeed, that's kind of the impression that you get from many of these images. Because if you think on that, that would be the aspect of that society. I like how it says that, the greatest and finest atlas ever published. That's some good marketing right there. Apparently it said the same thing when they published it in 1665. And now looking at this other piece of art, you can see that even though this is an introduction to the atlas, and it's always interesting to me, the different terminology in the different languages, again, you get some of the reflections of the same sorts of artwork with the idealized figures, these angelic child cherubs. And yet here we see a very interesting depiction of what is supposed to be the sun, or soul as it's referred to at that time. And we zoom in on it and we see that it has the nature or personification of soul. You have to remember that in a lot of Christian and even the major three religions of the land to this day, depicting the sun with a face is, well, it's considered ill-advised. It's not an adequate representation of what the symbolism is supposed to be of religion. And yet here we see soul, or the sun with a face, with its light, its power, being beamed towards what seems to be this mirror. And then we have this very interesting matriarchal figure that's holding this mirror, and that it's reflecting the sunlight, or the energy. And then it's down here to this cherub figure holding a torch. Now, I had some issues with trying to transpose sections of this book, so I apologize for the lack of clarity in this image. I think what I'm going to do with subsequent explorations is it's just going to be very brute force and ignorance, and I'm just going to use my phone and talk it through as I go. But I just wanted to take some time to really analyze these images, because something is very clearly being stated in this work of art. Is this technology? Is this knowledge? Is this both? I think it could reflect both. And it's reflected in the symbolism of that society. Now, what exactly do we have here? Here we have what we're told are depictions from the Americas, and I had received a request to take a look at what maps were available, especially of the New York area, and we'll definitely get to that. But I thought it's also interesting to note that some of the other artwork that appears within this Atlas Mayor, it seems to give us that idealized representation of every group of people that's being depicted in here. In other words, you don't get the sense that anybody's being denigrated in any way, shape, or form, and you might think that's what we'd expect, especially in an atlas that was made at that time in the 1600s, at least if we go off the historical account. And yet it seems as though we're given a completely different impression that everyone lived their lives, and they seem to be living their lives in balance. I don't know, maybe I'm just interpreting it incorrectly. Maybe I'm way off base. Please let me know in the comments what your interpretations are of this artwork. What's this represent to you? Are these really the people of that time, or are these reflecting another people who existed potentially before the reset? And again, this is more artwork that managed to be included with the translation of the Atlas from the civilization when it was actually composed in. Now, we also recall that there are many other lands that may be available. For example, and this is just one example that I'm taking from the map just to show you how some of the maps are drawn out, you have quite a variance in terms of map quality. Oftentimes you think that a map would have lines of latitude and lines of longitude, and you can ascertain your exact position. I mean, indeed, the Urbano Monte map has that, and the larger scale maps in the Atlas Mayor have it, but some of the smaller ones don't necessarily have it to the same degree. But apparently they use what's called terrain association and location of the cities. And you see that there are some very well-developed coasts with interesting river systems and other depictions being made on them. Now, we're not going in our in-depth analysis yet. This is just merely an example of what we actually have and what we're looking at. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind, that there could be other representations with what we're looking at. Because you also have to realize that what was really the purpose behind this atlas? Was this really for navigation? Or could this simply have been the best knowledge they had that survived from the previous civilization? And even though this might have been a work of some sort of, dare I say, their version of comedy, this was the best that they could do in the current civilization. It's hard to say. This is a very unique and intriguing depiction of an island. Now, the exact location of this island, here you can actually extrapolate some of the potential locations from it. I'm not going to share it with you because I would like you to take a look at it and tell me what you think this is a representation of. Where do you think this interesting island is actually located? What exactly do you think is the story behind this particular terrain feature? Do we actually have an island like that anywhere in the land where you see a terrain feature like this that's reflected in this sort of detail? Or is this merely something that's the prospect of someone's imagination? Perhaps the cartographer received an erroneous report from one of the sailors, if we're to take the historical account at face value. And yet when you look closer, you see other odd clues and certain details that don't exactly seem to add up with what we'd think of as the nature of islands. Especially when you consider what the academic position on the exact location of this island is, there's a lot of things that tend not to really make a lot of sense. And here I'll give you the final hint here so I don't leave you completely in the dark. But by all means, let me know what you think in the comments about both this depiction and what this really represents. And now let's just take a look at one of our Central European maps. And what I noticed in this Atlas Major is two things. One, they do seem to go to great lengths of detail to show exactly the actual course of the rivers. Now, when we think about that, that would make sense from both an alternative history and a mainstream perspective because the rivers really used for navigation, and it's true, they were critical for logistics if you think about it. The only issue is if rivers operate the way that we believe, then prior to the advent of the paddle steamer, you could really only use rivers one way in a lot of manners. Now, as we zoom in here, you can see that we're actually looking at Frankfurt in the middle of Germany. And once again, we have the usual geometrically precise foundation structure, which is actually depicted on numerous cities throughout this Atlas Major. And it definitely reinforces the notion that there was a great foundation underneath many of these cities, unless we're to simply take the mainstream account at face value and believe that these were elaborate fortifications and this was the best way to achieve a static defense. And of course, remember the military maxim that fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of humanity. Also noticing all the coats of arms. Now, intriguing that there's also a coat of arms that represents cities, counties, entire nations, the monarchy. Could these coats of arms have been symbols that had carried forward from the previous civilization? That's something I've always considered because I know in my own family coat of arms, we actually have a depiction of griffins that, according to our family history, had to be changed to lions because griffins were not considered a Christian or Catholic enough animal at that time. Always an intriguing account, and there you see we have the double-headed eagle, and we know what the concept of duality is, or at least the perception of duality, when in fact it is one single being. And now we look at this overall map of Europe, and this is where you'll see that you have the lines of latitude and longitude, and you could potentially fix your position. You also have to be determined to notice exactly how accurate the map is and the depiction of it. Indeed, we have the Black Sea, we have the Mediterranean and all of its unique courses. And we can see that every little detail is depicted in fine minutia, especially if you look in certain areas and you can see the layout of where the cities are supposed to be. Now, we're told that this was the best atlas that's ever been constructed, and we also have to think and compare it to the Urbano Monte map. The other question I would pose to you is this atlas not accurate because they didn't have satellites or aerial imagery at the time? Or was this even more accurate than what we're shown now? That's always a question that I have. Let's go on to this depiction, and this is very intriguing because, again, we have to ask, what's exactly the purpose of this depiction? Because, again, it looks like we have several sailing ships, whether we would consider them carracks or cogs or whatever the sailing ship of the day really was, and if it is exactly as we were told that it was. We have a very odd depiction, though, where it looks like we have 6 ships that are in what appears to be a very odd-looking inlet. Now, we wouldn't exactly classify this as an island, but we could classify it as a rather strange island. You might just simply say that perhaps the artists are making some extravagant depictions in order to gain more attention to the Atlas Mayora. But you have the ships like this lined up, and we're well aware of the traditions that are associated with Dutch and their capabilities of sailing at that time. Indeed, if you ever watch the miniseries Shogun, you'll realize that Pilot Major John Blackthorne was actually on Dutch ships at the time. And who were the Dutch closely associated with in terms of their so-called European identity? It's quite intriguing, and indeed the depiction of this crescent moon-shaped outcropping or island, or whatever you want to call it, is very unique. And what exactly is that representing? And that's another question that we have to ask. What's it truly showing? And does this reflect something that may have existed? Or does this reflect something else? Perhaps something in terms of a portal? Or is my imagination running wild? By all means, let me know what you think in the comments. And now we go to Great Britain and Scotland at the time. And Wales. See, I'm not forgetting Wales. And another interesting aspect, and we'll look at some of the artwork on either side of the map, we can actually see that they have coats of arms depicted for the separate areas of Great Britain and Wales at that time. And again, we think on the coats of arms, and you can imagine how they were associated with certain geographical areas. The other striking aspect with this depiction of this map is, again, how accurate it is. Although, again, I ask the question, is this the most accurate map, or is that what we have available now? Especially when we take a look at our friends from Google Maps. And we're told and we're reassured continuously that our friends who compose the Google Maps are constantly revising them and taking footage, and we know that we see the accurate footage all the time. I'm very impressed by how detailed the depiction of Scotland is, though, in the atlas, because it seems as though every single inlet, every single lock was very well known to the map makers. Now we can look at what our mainstream historical account tells us about the relations and the awareness of the wider world, but the trouble with that is we're trying to ascertain perceptions of people who were alive hundreds of years ago, and that's not as easy as you might think. Very interesting series of artistic images that are affiliated with this particular map. And again, I'll ask you to impose your imaginations and tell me exactly what you think is going on here. Now remember, this is well after what we'd be told is the Elizabethan era, or however you want to say it, in the Great Britain area, the reign of Queen Elizabeth. But we have many different depictions that reflect many other things. We also have to remember that this was also depicted in the time frame of the English Civil War, and we recall the rule of the major generals. Is that in any way reflected in this particular map or not? And that's always one thing you try to determine, because did the maps actually reflect contemporary events? For example, if you looked at one of our maps that was produced now in 2024, would it reflect the political situation? Or if you just looked at the map, you would think that anywhere in the world is a very peaceful place. It's an intriguing aspect. Well, what do you think of this initial exploration of the Atlas Mayora? And we're going to have different explorations for all channel members and some for Prime Explorers that will look in detail at the Shape of the Land coming soon. Thank you for joining me.
I'd love to stay, but
Welcome, channel members, and for a long time I've wanted to do an exploration on caves. Now, we've looked at caves a couple times in the past, especially in Iowa, in regards to our rather unique story of our total eclipse of the heart for over a year or two based on folklore there, going back to that story of both Dyersville and Dubuque. And you may recall in the distant past, I even took a look at the Maquoketa Caves, which are also another series of caves that are within the vicinity of Dubuque, as if there's not enough reason to go there. But it's funny when you look at some of the articles and how people even look at the caves in Iowa. And I thought I'd give you a little bit more detail, aside from the fact that, yes, we have some folk tales that there were people who survived in these caves during some terrifying calamity in the past that is rather ill-defined. What a surprise. And the article says, Iowa caves, caves in Iowa? Well, as you've all found out, there's virtually everything in Iowa. It turns out the best Iowa State Park is also perhaps the most unique. Here they call it the Hawkeye State. Yeah, be careful who you say that to. Maquoketa Cave State Park is well put together with a variety of sights to see that can occupy you for hours.
And of course, they go on talking about all the different caves, but here's the interesting part that I haven't shared so much: the history of Iowa caves. It's one of the oldest state parks in Iowa. Makokata has the largest cave system in the state. Even before becoming a state park, it was a popular spot in the mid 1800s for people to visit. Ah, yes, of course. During that whole Civil War, let's go out to Makokata Caves, load up the wagon, we're heading over there to go visit it. What exactly is that based on? And no, this isn't the author of this article making some kind of creative liberty. That is what the official history says. Unfortunately, due to its age and lack of watchful eyes, consistent in Iowa parks, many of the amazing features of the caves and other formations have been broken off and stolen. Ah, yes, so here we have someone arguing for more regulation. Yes, another interesting feature about Iowa state parks: you don't actually have to pay to go there. But, we need more regulation, and they're damaging the park, and so on and so forth. But that's not why I'm doing this exploration. The real reason I wanted to come back to the caves, and I'm starting with Makokata Caves, is recall that we have that legend, that folktale, the fact that these caves were used as a place of shelter. And I put a lot of validity in that claim. Now, does that mean that it's incontrovertibly true? No, but it means there are several indicators that state that it very well could be true. But the question I wanted to pose to all of you channel members is, what do you think caves really are overall? Because it's a question I really haven't put down before. Do we think caves are the foundations of old world structures from previous eras? Quite possibly. Could they be the remains of some kind of more complex and advanced infrastructure? That's another possibility. And where exactly do they go? With our end old dialogue and all of our debates in terms of what the shape of the land is, how exactly do caves factor into that? How far actually into the ground can we go? Yes, I know we have our super borehole, but we're not going to take a look at that because that's a rather problematic exploration. It's also for another time. But when you look at the images of the Makokata caves and how extensive they really are, you can realize and actually get the idea it is possible that a group of people, if they were well enough equipped and of course supplied, could take refuge in such caves in Iowa, and then actually came out after whatever sort of disaster or calamity, whether it was plasma fire or endless lightning from the sky, something else we can't even begin to imagine. The other interesting thing about the caves, at least these caves, is that they're at a slightly higher elevation, unlike the other caves that we looked at that are closer to Dubuque, just south of it. So just all interesting considerations to keep in mind. And, as always, I don't know what the answer is, and that's why I'm asking you. I want to know what your thoughts are on these caves. Now, for our next cave system, we're going to take a look at the Nutty Putty Caves, heading over to Utah. Now, for those of you who are familiar with caving in the history of Utah, you will know that there is a very terrifying tragedy that's affiliated with this cave, that in fact necessitated its close, and it is no longer accessible to the public, in 2009, after the unfortunate death of a cave explorer in that same time frame. But we'll get to that in a moment. But what's intriguing about the Nutty Putty Cave in Utah is just looking on the inside of it and how extensive it is. It's not exactly a cave where you have these vast caverns like you think of that we just looked at in Iowa. This is definitely a much more constrained and compressed area, as you can see in these images. Definitely not a place for those who have a sense of claustrophobia. Of course, I remember when I was climbing into a tank the first time and I was told, you're probably not going to do too well in this job if you're claustrophobic. It's not the first time I heard that, and it's probably not going to be the last time. But the intriguing thing about the Nutty Putty Cave is, what exactly is it? The issue is, and again, I don't want to hand wave away the disaster, what actually occurred. An individual lost their life in a very terrifying way, and you can certainly look at that story. They got stuck in the cave and they couldn't be rescued. But what you realize is there seems to be some rather unique nature to this particular cave. And some of the images almost giving you the impression that we're looking at something that, dare I say, I'm going off of the gigantic old organism theory with this. Or, what they might call mud fossil, or Roger over at Mud Fossil would say it's a mud fossil, that they're actually going around the remnants of some large organism that's been turned to stone over a long period of time. The nature of these Nutty Putty caves was very, very problematic, and here you can see on the diagram what was problematic about it. Well, they're very constrained. You don't really have a lot of room to maneuver and explore. Now, granted, while it'd be one thing to climb into an armored combat vehicle, it's another thing to actually go exploring caves where you don't really have a lot of room. But, as they say, is there a difference between bravery and stupidity? I leave that up to you to decide. I mean, I'll be honest, there's plenty of times I do things that many people would probably be considered stupid, like going around a certain state park lake on rocky terrain with very, very poor boots. But anyway, we remember that story, don't we? And then we get to the tragic incident that warranted the closure of the cave, a man named John Edward Jones in 2009. He became stuck, and you can find numerous references in the actual write-ups on this terrifying story, and how they tried to rescue him for over 27 hours, but because he was in a position of being inverted, you could see in the images just how compressed those caves really were, they were unable to rescue him, and in fact, they were unable to retrieve his body, tragically. A result of which was the caves being closed, and they've been closed to this day. Now, there are accounts of some individuals that have tried to access them, but of course they've been caught by security personnel. So, anyway, this article finishes with talking about the lessons for young adventurers, although it gets more interesting. But so far, we've looked at two different series of caves, a little bit different in Iowa and Utah. And the question I have for you is, what do you think these caves really are? And remember the options that we have, and if you have your own ideas, by all means, let me know in the comments. Now back to crystal caves. Now you may recall when we were looking at the really intriguing myth and legends map from Wisconsin, and don't worry, I'm going to get back to that. Once I get the rest of my equipment repaired, I intend to get back to that, along with that very interesting map of Iowa that I know you all want to see. And I think I'll just go ahead and share that with all channel members because I'm feeling very, very generous. Crystal caves, when nature grows crystals. Now, way back in the nascent days of the channel, it's already been over 2 years ago, I was looking into these crystal caves, and they have a crystal cave in Wisconsin, a crystal cave in Ohio, one in California, and then one of the most impressive ones in Mexico, which we've looked at and talked about before. But just think about this, these caves with these gigantic crystals in them. Now, what exactly are these? And this is where I think of the possibility of perhaps some sort of old power generator. Because remember, when we've looked at and explored the various forms of energy that come from crystals, and I'm not just talking about the known scientific forms, because yes, crystals really do generate energy, and science even confirms that. But there may be many other means that crystals generate energy. And there's a lot of other theories in terms of what role they may have played in powering an old civilization. But things are always very, very interesting when you look into these caves, and you can certainly see here in this image how large these crystals really are. I mean, kind of reminds me of Krypton, the original Krypton on the original Superman film from 1978. Yes, we're going to be talking about that this weekend. I thought it only fitting. When they had an entire planet that was made out of crystal. Well, maybe this was something that inspired it. Who knows for sure? And the less said about Superman Returns, the better. But yes, I know it factored into the plot of that movie. Although, between us, I thought that movie should have ended after he rescued the airplane. But just my opinion. Maybe you like it, and that's totally fine. But then you see just how large these crystals really are. Now, there's all kinds of theories, and I'm going to say it's exactly what they are, theories for how these largest natural crystals formed. But what if they're actually connected to something else? What if there is a lot more truth, or hidden truth, if you will, that is put in the original Superman movie, and Superman 2 for that fact. And yes, I guess the Fortress of Solitude made an appearance in Superman 4, but again, less said about that film, the better. But very interesting. Some sort of power system, remaining infrastructure from some kind of old world system that we can't even begin to imagine. And remember, we're baffled by the technology that we come across, even in the remaining cathedrals and very obvious old world structures that we have all over the land, And maybe you actually believe that the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, was actually built over a period of 600 years. And maybe you really believe that people during that time frame were actually able to construct that structure. Now, I'm not snickering because I'm laughing at the idea of it. But for me, what I'm really snickering at is the fact that the way that account is told, you would expect there to be several key points of construction in the past. But really the way it operates, and it was one of the things that kind of shined the light right in my face, aside from everything else that I saw, is the fact that the cathedral in Cologne, its documentation really starts in the 1800s. And I found that very, very peculiar. And you'll find similar stories when you look at the explorations of these caves. Now, I decided to save the best for last, the two deepest caves in the world, which happen to be located in the nation, not the state, of Georgia. And it's in a disputed region of Georgia, Abkhazia. Both of these caves. The Varovkina Cave, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, and I didn't check the pronunciation, but that's okay. You can see the name of it, and you can look it up on your own if you're so inclined to explore it. But a very, very deep cave. 7,247 feet deep in Abkhazia in Georgia. And they even have this very impressive diagram, and this is the reason why I picked this, that really gives you an idea of just how deep this cave actually is. Now, of course, this is in meters, but just do the conversion. It's all good. You saw how deep it was for those of us in the English system. Why do we have two standards of measurement? I don't know. Don't ask me. But when you look at this, what do you think this really is? Going down 7,000 feet into the ground. Does this represent some kind of access point to something else? There's all kinds of legends and myths that these caves actually connected into some kind of super transportation system that existed deep underground. Is this part of that, or is this something else? And as always, I welcome your feedback and your opinions. And believe me, while I might have snickered at the whole idea of the cathedral in Cologne, I do still keep it in my mind that yes, the historical account could be correct, but just the way that people would passionately teach the history back in the day, and they would say, yes, we know that it took them 600 years, but most of our documentation understanding of it started in the 1800s. Coincidentally, the same time that everybody just started going to Makokata Caves in Iowa in the 1800s. But then the folk tales tell you that they hid in the caves when a disaster occurred. So what's the real timeline? What's really going on? Just between us, I think it tends to be a little bit more than 1,000 years, because we don't have any idea what date it is. And then, of course, here we have Kribera Cave, which is relatively close and also located in Georgia in the Abkhazia region, a disputed region. Now, this is actually the deepest one, and it's just a few feet deeper than the one that we just looked at. And again, very, very impressive diagram that just shows you how deep this really goes. Lost World Gallery. Gee, I wonder why they call it that. Now, I've been to Makokata Caves. I've been to some of the crystal caves, including the one in Wisconsin. I have not been to these caves in Georgia, but I would certainly like to go explore them. And no, I'm not someone who's going to be deterred from exploration just because there may be some hazards. Life is full of hazards. But this really, really interested me in the fact that we do have these kind of diagrams, and we do seem to have a good idea for the layout of some of these caves and the different nature of them. But something else that really caught my attention was looking at some of these entrance images that we have to these caves. And you can get an idea that there does seem to be something that's a little bit beyond, how shall we say, natural formation. Now, I know if you want to say I'm seeing things, that's completely okay. Maybe I am. And that's why I always ask for another set of eyes. But when you see images such as this, yes, it definitely gives you the impression that there seems to be a little bit more of a, how shall we say, artificial component to it. I mean, maybe you see that all as something that's a natural formation. I mean, they look like blocks to me that have been subjected to some kind of terrifying forces, heat, and who knows what else. But what exactly is the story behind all this? How old is this, if this is in fact infrastructure from a previous era? Is this some sort of remnant from the third era, or maybe even earlier for all we know? I think there's a lot more mystery when it comes to caves, and there's many more possibilities, and that's what makes them very compelling to me. But a little bit of a different exploration and something that we don't really cover. Now, my intention is, once I've got my equipment repaired, is I intend to do a little spelunking here in the coming month. And don't worry, I don't intend to get stuck in a cave anywhere. But, if I do, I'm sure there's some people that would enjoy it. There's always going to be some people who enjoy it, but that's all right. Life is all about taking it as it comes. Anyways, I look forward to your comments. All right, so I decided we go back and take a look at St. Francis Xavier Basilica back in Dyersville. Now, we've explored this a couple times, but I wanted to relay the official history because there is a very nice summarized write-up here that's quite intriguing. And by the way, something I'll tell you, there are absolutely no construction photos of this incredible basilica to be found anywhere. Now, here's the history that we have. In 1862, the first Catholic church in Dyersville was completed and located in the lot immediately south of the basilica. Already in 1869, its size had to be doubled to accommodate the increasing number of Catholics moving in the area. Of course, if you look at the population numbers of Dyersville and the county, they don't necessarily corroborate that. And remember, Dubuque was nearby, but never mind. By 1880, the Catholic population had again outgrown the enlarged church, and in September 1887, construction on the present basilica was started. The cornerstone of the church was laid on June 3rd, 1888, and on December 3rd, 1889, the new church was dedicated by Bishop Hennessy of Dubuque. So keep that in mind. This incredible basilica in a town of 1,000 people, not in Dubuque, mind you, was completed just over 2 years. Yes, of course it is. You see that kind of construction. Now, can you imagine? Could you imagine us building a church like this today with all modern implements? Do you really think it could be done in 3 years? Well, if you're questioning that, look up that incredible shrine to Our Lady Guadalupe in La Crosse in nearby Wisconsin and see how long it took them to build that, because that was very recently constructed. And does it compare to this basilica? I leave that to you, but I think you know how I feel on the matter. In recognition of the architectural attributes of the church and the fervent faith of the congregation, St. Francis Xavier Church was raised to the rank of a minor basilica in 1956 by a proclamation of His Holiness Pope Pius XII. Very interesting character, Pope Pius XII. At that time, St. Francis Xavier was the 12th church in the country to receive such an honor. Today, the Basilica of St. Francis Xavier is one of 53 basilicas in the United States. It's in Iowa, in Dyersville, in a town that only has a couple thousand people to this day. And you may recall the other historical elements to it, that it was funded by the locals in the town. Yeah, the farmers. They contributed the money to build this incredible, impressive edifice, one of only 53 basilicas today in the United States. Makes sense. Some statistics. The height of each spire is 212 feet. The exterior dimensions 70 by 175. The height of the church is 76 feet. Okay, now moving in. Here's the good one. The original construction cost was approximately $100,000. Yeah, calculate the inflation on that. Funded by townspeople. Well, it's just like the collection that they took down in Kansas City to fund the construction of Liberty Tower or the World War I monument, right? We could just collect it from the people. Everyone's loaded with money. Everybody was rich. It was the 1800s. It was the early 1900s. But what are your thoughts on this impressive edifice? Now, a couple rumors. And again, this is a structure I have on tap to get on site and look at personally. There are rumors that there is a very extensive basement system to this church that are now inaccessible. Again, just rumors. Other rumors indicate that it's been renovated many times. Yes, we always have those little stories and those little accounts, don't we? But are they true? Hard to say. And you may recall looking at this particular church, some of the images that you have on the interior. It's extremely impressive. It seems to have an actual authentic old world organ. And remember, you can't get much more Catholic than that symbol, right? Remember the account that we have of this particular structure, being at the nexus point of where there may well have been a hole in reality opened, if the folk tales are true. Very, very odd. And then looking at some of these other impressive features that we have. Now, of course, we'll simply say that these are religious features, and they may well be. They may have been added later. But you look at some of the details within this very impressive church, and it just completely boggles the imagination. Now, I very much want to get on site and assess it. I mean, look at some of the detail with the columns here. Again, is anybody going to build something like this in just over 2 years today? And then take them 2 years just to try to dig the foundation. Yes, that's with bulldozers and everything else that we have. I'm being a little facetious, but maybe I'm not, because really, who is building a structure like this anywhere?